So, thank you for being with us, Jim. We have a lot of interesting questions to ask you based on things that you've written and questions that has triggered in our own minds. So the first one on the book of Why Nations Fail, you talk about the fact that institutions underlie economic success and that creating incentives for innovation, allowing people to participate in economic opportunities behind the success of Korea and other countries like that. So after having thought a lot about this, what is the three most important things that we can think about effective ways to get billions of people out of poverty?
Well, I think that's mostly about politics, actually. Even though the book is sort of about economics and inclusive economic institutions, as you're saying, promote, incentives and broad-based participation, and extractive economic institutions don't. But ultimately, getting those, you don't get inclusive economic institutions from the whim, of some autocrat or whatever it is. You get that because society is politically inclusive. So I'd say the most important lessons are, if you want to have inclusive economies and prosperity and innovation, you have to have inclusive politics, and that's about having, very broad-based participation, kind of empowerment of people politically, and, you don't get good things, unless people demand them or they force elites to provide them, So, but it's not just about empowerment and broad-based kind of power. It's also about having a state which has capacity to provide public goods and resolve disputes and kind of provide a sort of forum in which that empowerment can be productive or kind of pushed in productive directions. So we emphasize those two dimensions about, political institutions. So I would say that's the kind of key message, but that's only two things, and you wanted a third thing.
So maybe I can guide you a bit. So when you say about these more extractive practices, there's a feeling among a lot of people that the aid business is quite extractive as well, in that it sort of perpetuates itself and it really never helps these more autonomous organizations or governments to anything to.
My view of the aid industry is that the aid business does lots of good things. Like anyone who's been around in poor countries sees all the good things that aid does. It gets a roof on the school, or maybe it creates a school. It builds a well so people don't have gastrointestinal diseases. Who paid for the roads in Sierra Leone or Congo, or so that level, and then also the aid industry has innovated in many other directions, community-driven development. Whose idea was that? Was that some academic idea? No, it wasn't. It was an idea that came out of NGOs and came out of the aid industry. But I just think that, usually the aid industry isn't set up to kind of really address the kind of systemic political issues, that hold development back. But I don't see the aid industry as kind of some massive impediment to that. I see it as doing lots of good things. It's just often because of political constraints, it's not able to tackle the bigger issues, or, with things like community-driven development, it's a sort of a great idea, but it just needs to be more sensitive to the context and the culture, and I think something like community-driven development, some sort of one-size-fits-all, we're in Myanmar, we're in Sierra Leone, we're going to do what we're in the Eastern DRC. That, you need to learn very much, the Scott Guggenheim kind of project in Indonesia, the kind of thing that Scott tried to do, it seems to me never kind of accumulated into a bigger agenda. If you look at community-driven development in Sierra Leone, that took place without any investigation of the relevant aspects of Sierra Leonean society,
So that's why it didn't go further.
That's my conjecture. Yeah. So that's kind of my view. I don't think of it as a big problem. I just think of it as sometimes just not addressing the main issue, but doing many other good things.
Other good things. So Wolfenson once, using the Voices of the Poor, talked to all the governors of the World Bank and the annual meetings and said, we have listened to 60,000 people in poverty, and what they say that what we in the aid business would do best is to invest in the organizations owned by the poor. What would you say to that?
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. I mean, who ultimately, who has the biggest incentive to make sure that services get provided or public goods get provided? It's the beneficiaries of them. Think of, Federal Express, when does Federal Express know something's not going right? When someone complains, I didn't get my package, where's my package? It's sort of like, that's how many businesses actually operate, and I think that's right. I think the problem is, we don't know enough, at least social scientists don't know enough about how to effectively organize people, I think, in ways that allow them to interface in a productive way with the state. There's lots of interesting examples of that. A Colombian example, in the late 60s, Carlos Lleras, when Carlos Lleras was president, he wanted to do agrarian reform. He really thought that the only way to have a kind of modern and sort of politically stable Colombia was to do agrarian reform. So they passed all these agrarian reform laws. Nothing happened. He couldn't get the local state to kind of enforce it or actually implement it. So then he thought, okay, let's go and empower the people. So he started this ANUC, this like campesino union, okay? And he hired all these academics and people. There's these amazing things. They wrote all these cartoon books there's a cartoon history of the Caribbean coast of all like the agrarian injustices. They're absolutely amazing reading today. And it was incredibly successful. By 1970, there were 1 million people in this union. But the thing is, how do they interface in a productive way with the state? They started doing land grabs and invading farms, and then the farmers started hiring, pistoleros and bumping off the leaders. And then 1 million campesinos suddenly organized that mainstream political parties panicked, and did everything. So it was just, they were fabulously successful at mobilizing these people, but there wasn't a kind of productive way to interface with the state. So I think that's an interesting
Fascinating.
lesson.
So we work at Imago Global Grassroots with organizations like those, the labor unions in India, SEWA, that interface with the state, and we work to help strengthen their organizations. What would be your advice to us in thinking of this problem precisely? How to help them in that interface?
Well, I don't know. I think that's about institutions. It's about, maybe political decentralization and finding a way, like participatory budgeting, I think, in Brazil, which did a very good job of actually kind of incorporating mass participation and voice into the process of formulating a budget, in the city. I think that's an example where an institutional architecture did lead to this kind of productive interface between the state and society. And despite all the problems in Brazil, there's a lot of evidence that was extremely good for public good provision and all sorts of things. So that's an example. I think you have to probably redesign local political institutions so that people can really take part and influence in a way that is legitimate from the point of view of the politicians, and not just a kind of tool of clientelism, or not just kind of hijacked as a vehicle, of clientelism.
So that interface has to happen at the local government level.
I would say so. Like many people say, for example, even the madres of the Plaza Mayor in Argentina became hijacked by the Peronist party. You often, that's something organic that came from society. They're organized, they're motivated, immediately the politicians want to capture them. So that you have to stop that too. So I don't know if there's a recipe for that, but there's certainly successful examples. The Colombian example is not successful. But in the peace negotiations with the FARC, one of the things that the High Commissioner for Peace, Sergio Jaramillo, was very focused on was, he had this idea of the territorial peace, and that was kind of learning the lessons of failed attempts to do this in Colombia and try to figure out, I don't think any of it's being implemented now, he's left, but trying to figure out exactly how could you get people mobilized to pressure the state, but kind of interface with them in a productive way. But
so this makes me think of your new book coming out, The Balance of Power, where you talk about this corridor to liberty getting narrower and narrower. First, it's a problem in the best of cases, but today, in the midst of this destabilization, it's getting narrower. What could you say about today in terms of this need to interface between the popular organizations and demands and the state in the US, let's say, or in Latin America?
Yeah, that's a sort of set of grand ideas about how you have to have the state pushing society and society pushing the state, and you have to have this balance between state and society. How do I think about that in the United States at the moment? I don't know. I mean, I think this consequence of this long sort of increase in inequality and this kind of polarization of U.S. society, and U.S. looks more and more like a Latin American country, doesn't it? Like the flyover zone. People in the East. One of my students who's she's from Oklahoma. She's tenured at Harvard now. She always says, like, at Harvard more people have been to Ghana than Oklahoma. Like, who knows? No, who knows what goes on? There's no academic conferences in Oklahoma. Like, people, like so. But that's like a Latin American country. I mean, I don't know what Peru is like, but in Colombia, people in Bogota have like no idea what goes on. They know more about what goes on in Miami than they do in somewhere 10 miles down the mountain, So that sort of core periphery, and that's Brexit also, the core and the periphery, look at these voting patterns, it has this very core periphery kind of feel to it. So I'd say, that's a situation where it's much more difficult to get a kind of productive interaction between state and society, and it seems to breed, in a way that I don't totally understand, this kind of populist politics, which also seems to throw all of these totally spurious kind of dimensions into the debate, like blaming the Chinese, or the Venezuelans blaming the Americans, or it's sort of like somehow you can't focus on the real problem, or there's all this distraction. I don't know why it is that inequality or this creates a sort of potential for this distraction in politics, but I guess something's going wrong. What's going wrong? Well, we need a new explanation for that, because the old explanations don't work. So here's a new explanation. It might be spurious, but let's all throw it in there. So I think in the US case, that it's going into reverse. I think, like, you see Michael Lewis's book about the Trump state clearly shows that there's enormous kind of decapacitation of the state, in the US. And that's because President Trump wants to rule in this very personalized way. He doesn't want people telling him you can't do that, or that's not a good idea. So there's this decapacitation of the state. There's this undermining of the state capacity. So that's undermining the role of that's undermining the ability of the state to kind of productively interface with society or provide services. And at the same time, society is becoming kind of riven with these cleavages and stuff, which makes it very difficult for them to kind of act collectively. There's all these kind of spurious identity issues. So I would say, in terms of our model, the corridor is getting narrower, and it's meaning it's more difficult to stay inside it. I mean, I would say, in the book we have this one chapter which is called, this dynamic between state and society. We call it the Red Queen effect. Like in Alice Through the Looking Glass, where the Red Queen and Alice have this race, and they race and they stay in the same place. But we have one chapter which we call Red Queen Out of Control, which is sort of historical examples where this kind of spins out of control. And I would say, like, I don't have a mathematical model of that, actually, so this is like very inductive, like just trying to look at cases like Chile in 1973 maybe, or not, the Weimar Republic, or, the Italian city-states in the medieval period, places where you had enormously kind of successful transitions towards something that looks much better, and then you just get this totally kind of explosive dynamic. And I think one stylized fact about all of that is this enormous kind of polarization and refusal to compromise on any issue. Like, if you look at one of the most depressing things, if you read some German history, the interwar period, is the scene of the Nazis and the communists colluding to bring down the Weimar Republic. So that to guarantee that the Nazis and the communists, who both had these extreme polarized visions, but they just wanted to abolish democracy, and so they went out of their way to collude to make sure the government couldn't do anything and pass any law. They'd make all these procedural things, just to kind of screw everything up. Can I say that? Yeah. So Weimar, go to Allende. You may say whatever Allende, whatever you may say about Allende, he had a genuine project or whatever. He was totally unwilling to compromise on anything. There's a wonderful interview that Regis Debray, the French Marxist intellectual, did with Allende. About like, what's your strategy? You don't have a majority. How are you going to get this done? And I think Allende, he was genuinely convinced that Chile would be better off as a socialist. That was his project, but he couldn't imagine compromising, and the right couldn't imagine compromising either. So this seems to be a kind of, and that worries me also about the United States, because I've been here for 33 years, more or less, and politics has dramatically changed in that period. Republicans and Democrats are enormously more polarized and unwilling to compromise than they were 33 years ago. And that's also a very worrying sign. I don't know how that's connected to this inequality. I mean, it's a kind of dynamics that's playing itself out at a very similar kind of period and similar rate. I'm not sure exactly how that's connected to it. But it's also very worrying from the perspective of our book. That does seem to be a stylized fact. Whereas the ability to compromise can lever you into the corridor. Think about South Africa. That was very painful. Like Mandela and Ramaphosa and all these people. They did not want to compromise with those guys, who'd beaten them up and imprisoned them.
But they did.
But they did because they understood that that was the way to get a different society for their children, and
Is there a time in history where there was maybe a big technological change or something that brought about a similar inequality than we have today?
I think the estimates of the impact of the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century suggest it went along with very rapidly rising inequality. I mean, the big fact about inequality in the US today is it's now returned to the level it was at, in the early part of the century. That's not true. It's not true in Western Europe actually. Inequality today is far below what it was in the 20s or 30s in Germany or France or Scandinavia. But it is true in England, and the US that it's back up. But how did it get so high, in 1900 or 1910? I think that's the industrial revolution. There was very rapid increasing inequality in the 19th century. So,
and what was the resolution to that?
Well, I think the resolution was the modern redistributive state, progressive taxation, income taxation, which only arrived in the US in 1912 or something or other. There was no income taxation before that. In Britain, the welfare states start. Minimum wages, trade unions become basically only legal. In the early part of the century, like 1906 or something or other. You can't sue a union for damages during a strike. I think it's progressive labour market legislation, redistribution. That's what. I don't think the big story. Just think about this fact. Why is it that inequality has risen so much in Britain and the US and not in France or Germany? Inequality in France and Germany has gone up, but it's basically the level it was at in the 1960s. Why is that? Because the French and German haven't dismantled the redistributive state, whereas the British and the US have. I mean, Mrs. Thatcher dismantled redistribution and taxes on inheritance and everything else, and so did Reagan. To me that's the story. But that's not about technology. It's not about globalization. It's about political choices and this retreat from a kind of more inclusive role of the state in society. So
the resolution has to be a political one.
I think so. Yes. Are Germany and France less globalized than Britain or the US? No, not at all. Probably more globalized. Yeah.
So we shouldn't be fearing so much creative destruction from technology, but rather the power accumulation.
I don't think so. I mean, I think if you look at the history of industrialization or the Industrial Revolution, well, it's very similar. In 200 years ago, everybody thought mechanization and innovation was going to replace labor. Machines were going to, that's why the Luddites went around smashing machines up. That's the story about technology for me. You could say maybe it's quantitatively much bigger now today. Robots and. But I kind of think, my more romantic moments, if you read Keynes's general theory, Keynes had this idea that this is great, machines are just going to remove all this drudgery and all these terrible jobs that kind of make human life so uninteresting, and we'll all be able to be poets and
work less hours. Yes, read.
Well, I like work myself, so I'm not into working less hours. What would I do? Watch television? Like my mother used to say, "Oh, what are you going to say on your deathbed?" Oh, I wished I'd watched more television.
So, Jim, yesterday you had a really interesting presentation about how one needs to think about changing norms, group norms, when there are states that are very weak or failed or corrupt. I wanted to talk a little bit about that before finishing. So when do you need to do it, and how do you do it? Change group norms in order to fix sort of long-term problems.
I think there's different views on that. If you talk to Antanas Mokas, the former mayor of Bogota, a lot of his strategy was based on, changing norms, intervening to change norms, to change people's idea about the state. And, he said once, it's not about citizens hanging around the state like flies. The state should be hanging around the citizens. Like you had to completely invert the logic. Like the main place in downtown Bogota, was called like the Intimidator. Because you went there and they sent you to another window, then you had to come back tomorrow, then you had the wrong documents, and then it wasn't notarized, and then you had like that sort of thing. So I think his idea was you had to change people's norms, you had to change the way people thought about the state, the way people behaved, the way people interacted with other people, and he had a lot of campaigns. At the same time, he was also building state institutions, like he privatized the electricity company, which was just full of political appointees who never did anything like power cuts, but he kept 49% for the city. So then the power company got its act together, they started collecting, they generated lots of revenues, he took that money and he spent it on public goods. So I think you need to do both, like the norms and the building institutions are kind of complementary, because changing norms and everything, that's great, but people want to see stuff happening. Somebody has to clean up the park, so you can hang out in it. Get the needles, or the reefers, or the rubbish, or that's complementary with people hanging out and reclaiming public spaces, which was a big thing he was into in the city, getting people back on the street and into parks and into squares. But I think there's complementary input, and you need resources for that. And so I think you have to work together, and that's the lesson of the book. The lesson of the book is, these big kind of sequencing arguments, that people love Huntington and Fukuyama. I think they're not, it's not good history, and it's not good prescription either. The idea you build state capacity, without thinking about people, but I think, Mokas was more, you build society and you work on norms, but I think, although he doesn't emphasize, if you look at the facts about the matter, he built institutions at the same time. That's true with Fajardo, it's true with a lot of these other examples. Like Lagos in Nigeria is a very interesting example of this, where there was a lot of attempt, to change norms, get people to pay their taxes, but there was also, I met Governor Fasuluku, who was the second governor. He told me, look, I was asking him about what went on, and he said, look, without resources, you can't do anything. You need money. You need money for people to really to provide stuff that people want, and that helps them believe that there's some payoff here. So his view was also, it's very complementary.
Yeah, I also think that you're thinking about complementary disciplines. You're talking about interventions that have to do with politics, with economics, with psychology.
Yeah.
All of them bringing them to bear for the shift, no?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's right. Yes. So there's lots of dimensions to that. I mean, I think that Mokas was very focused on just obeying rules. Like he had this idea, like he hired all these people to make fun of these mime artists
I
who made
remember that
fun.
you pick up the trash.
Well, yeah, and made fun of people who jaywalked,
Yes.
and you know, like you were like people who went through traffic lights or were driving badly, and you know, you had these thumbs up and thumbs down signs, and and so that was at the level of just general kind of social interaction and
collective experience
and rule breaking.
Yes.
But there was also stuff about politics, like you know, Fajardo very big on this, like don't sell your vote, don't get up. If you ever, he has this great speech about like get up off your knees, don't get on your knees, get off your knees, like just trying to make people feel proud and citizens with rights, and they should be doing things for you. You're not doing something for them. They should be doing things for you. So trying to change the kind of logic of the interaction between citizens and politicians, that was much more about politics, but it was also more broadly, but there were simultaneous interventions more broadly about society. Like one of the things Fajardo did in Antioquia was build these educational parks in all these municipalities, and it's a very romantic thing, like he told me, like, they have to be beautiful, it has to be beautiful, like, why, it has to be beautiful, why not? Because you're in, like, San Francisco, Antioquia, but you care about having something beautiful. So his idea was that it changes the whole psychology of, like, your attitude towards your home, and I thought that was great. I don't know if it's true.
I think it's true.
But yeah. And it also, like, exactly. So that was a very multi-dimensional intervention.
Yes.
It was about politics. It was about society. It was
design.
about your attitude. Yes.
Marketing.
Yes.
So maybe that's why the road is so narrow. It's such a complex problem, and you have to bring so many different points of view and frameworks and tools.
Yeah. So I guess pragmatically, you could say that. Maybe no society ever got all of those things in place at the same time. So it would be good. It would be kind of, and probably there's no necessary,
formula.
Yeah. That different places, and maybe some of it. If you get some of it in place, it makes it easier to get the other stuff. But I'm not sure I understand. I don't have a generalization at that level.
Anyway, looking forward to your book.
Me too. Yes, me too.
Great. Thank you very much, Jim.
My pleasure.
Great.